Imagine lying still, completely unable to move. Your arms feel heavy, your legs pinned down as if gravity itself has thickened around your body. And yet, you're somewhere else. You hear the silence, but it's not the silence of absence. It has depth, texture, as if time itself has been suspended, and reality stepped aside to make room for something ancient to emerge. You're fully aware this isn't a dream, not a hallucination. You are observing. But who is observing, if your body can't move? That question, whispered in secret by scientists working within U.S. intelligence, lingered for decades, buried in classified documents and dismissed as conspiracy. A top-secret experiment authorized by the CIA in the early 1980s, known as the Gateway Experience, described something far beyond neurology. It was as if a veil had been torn, and behind it, there was nothing but presence. But before this, truth could reach headlines. It was sealed beneath government stamps and institutional silence. The reason? It wasn't just about national security. It was because what they had uncovered couldn't be translated into science without unraveling the very foundations of what we call reality. This video is not an explanation, it's a key. And what if everything you've ever believed to be you is only a fragment of the whole? It was 1978 when physicist Thomas Campbell, working with NASA, entered a darkened room, headphones on, electrodes attached to his skull. He wasn't just seeking brain activity. He was looking for a crossing point between what's visible and what's always been just beyond it. Alongside him was Robert Monroe, a media executive turned consciousness explorer, pioneering a method of brainwave synchronization using sound frequencies. But what unfolded went far beyond frequencies or data. At one point, Campbell reported feeling as if he were floating outside of his own body, not in a vague, dreamlike way, but with clarity, as if his awareness had simply stepped out and was now calmly observing the vessel below. That moment became a pivot point, the beginning of what would become the CIA's Gateway project. And what startled the researchers from the start was a contradiction they couldn't ignore. The body was still, yet consciousness remained alert. Science, until that point, had equated consciousness with brain function, synapses firing, circuits activating. But what happens when awareness remains, even as the body slips into deep rest? This is the vibrational enigma. It's not just a philosophical question. It's a direct challenge to the boundaries between body and identity. Because if I am still here when the body is not, then the I is not the body. Buried within the CIA's declassified report is a startling line. Subjects reported an intensified perception of self outside the normal physical coordinates. That may sound clinical, but anyone who's experienced lucid dreams, deep meditation, or near-death knows there is something that continues. The real question isn't, what's happening to my brain? It's, why am I still here if my body is asleep? And that paradox, where the body is silent and yet the inner self remains awake, echoes through ancient traditions. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna tells Arjuna, the soul is never born and never dies. It cannot be cut, burned, drowned, or dried. The Essenes, in the deserts of Judea, believed the true temple was the part of you that stays awake when the body sleeps. The Gateway Project, in the language of science, was rediscovering something sacred. Participants who reached deep states of rest didn't dissolve into unconsciousness. Their awareness expanded. And what does that mean? That maybe consciousness isn't confined to the brain like light to a bulb. Maybe it's more like a field, connected to the body, but not created by it. This idea may make traditional science uncomfortable, but it's not new. Mystics have whispered it for centuries. The body is a reflection. The consciousness is the witness. When we fall into deep silence, when the breath slows and our senses recede, another kind of listening begins. Not with ears, but with vibration. And what it reveals is this: we are not limited to matter. The body sleeps, but the eye still sees, and that, perhaps, is the true mystery the Gateway began to uncover. Not as theory, but as truth felt from within. In a quiet lab in Virginia, a simple device played two slightly different tones, one into each ear. The brain, in response, began to perceive a third tone that didn't exist externally, a tone born not from sound but from perception. This is the principle behind Hemi-Sync, short for hemispheric synchronization. It was meant to bring both sides of the brain into rhythm. But what it began to reveal went far beyond the brain. It opened a path, a subtle map of the soul. Early subjects reported more than just relaxation. They described a soft lifting, a disconnection from physical form, not in terror or confusion, but with a strange familiarity, as if entering a space they had once known deeply and long ago forgotten. This wasn't a trance. It was a kind of heightened presence. The CIA's Gateway report documented these sessions in detail. Alpha and theta waves dominating, beta activity reduced, and what they called the emergence of extrasensory perceptions. In scientific terms, the brain had entered coherence, but beneath that coherence was something harder to name, a resonance with something else. What was that something? Quantum physics, when read poetically, not dogmatically, offers an elegant metaphor, that there are fields of information not bound to a single place in time or space. David Bohm, a visionary physicist, called it the implicate order, a deeper level of reality from which all things emerge. This implicate order behaves like a universal field of awareness, and what Hemi-Sync appeared to do was tune the mind to that field. It's no coincidence that ancient rituals used sound to induce altered states. In Egypt, priests trained for years in vibrational chants designed to shift awareness. The Essenes, mystics tied to the Dead Sea Scrolls, practiced inner journeys, guided by breath and rhythm, allowing the soul to step beyond the body. This here gateway technique, though framed in science, was not an invention. It was a remembering. Now expressed in modern terms, it became accessible to those who may never have entered through the door of mysticism. It allowed those shaped by logic and skepticism to touch the edge of something sacred. What emerged in these sessions was a pattern, not linear, but vibrational, as if the soul had always known the route and was simply waiting for the noise to quiet. And perhaps that's why so many participants felt a kind of calling, as if something deep inside them, dormant for decades, had been gently stirred awake. There were no visions, no divine voices, only a recognition of being home. The map revealed through Hemi-Sync wasn't a map of places, it was a map of states. States where time softens, where the body no longer confines, where identity transcends name or biography. This is the realm of the soul. And maybe Hemi-Sync is simply a tuning fork, awakening a tone that has always been vibrating, waiting to be remembered. Maybe that's what the CIA stumbled upon. Maybe they didn't fully grasp it, but the tone, it rang out. And once the soul hears its own frequency, it never forgets. At the heart of modern science lies a paradox, the relentless attempt to measure what was never meant to be measured. How do you quantify the scent of a memory? How do you contain the weight of a silence? The Gateway Project, though rigorous and empirical, was not immune to this paradox. It sought physical proof of metaphysical events, monitoring brainwaves, tracking physiological changes, compiling data, and yet, what emerged from the depths of those experiments wasn't a formula. It was a presence, a kind of knowing that refused to be pinned down by data. This is where the invisible mistake began to unfold. The subtle error of trying to compress the soul into equations. Because the spiritual experience doesn't conform to scientific law. It breathes, it dissolves, it lives outside repetition. The participants spoke not of numbers, but of being seen, of feeling reunited with something wordless, timeless. And yet, the language of the report turned this into altered states and non-local perception. What they were truly describing was remembrance. Carl Jung once wrote, "The symbol is the best possible expression for something that cannot be fully known." And isn't that what the soul is? A living symbol, present yet elusive, radiant yet beyond the lens. Inside the CIA's technical environment, what was actually happening was never just neurological, it was archetypal. And that language has no graphs. Science wants replication. But what was unfolding here was singular, internal, sacred, and that scared people. Because traditional science, built on control, on logic, on observable outcomes, becomes deeply unsettled in the presence of the ineffable. It cannot own it. It cannot command it. To acknowledge the soul is to admit there are truths that exceed the laboratory. And for many, that's a terrifying surrender. It would mean that the rational mind, so carefully constructed, is not the peak of human experience, but merely a tool, one piece of a larger, vaster intelligence. And yet, even with all its data, all its measurements, the Gateway Report could never pin down the one thing that pulsed beneath every page: presence. The soul can't be proven, but it can be recognized, and when it is not, when we deny that invisible presence long enough, something inside us begins to fade, not our intellect, but our center. The result isn't just spiritual emptiness, it's emotional fatigue, disorientation, a deep, quiet ache that no rational explanation can soothe. Because we've tried to live with half of who we are. The mind on its own becomes a machine, cold, predictable, dull. That's the invisible mistake. The drive to validate what must be felt, to dissect what must be lived. Perhaps that's why the Gateway Project was never fully embraced, because it brushed up against a mystery that couldn't be controlled, that whispered instead of shouted, and whispers aren't archived. They are heard. They are honored. They are answered with silence. Throughout ancient cultures, the mirror was never just a tool for reflection. It was a threshold. In Egypt, myths told of souls encountering a polished obsidian surface after death. Only those who could recognize their true essence within it could pass through. To the Gnostics, the mirror symbolized radical inner knowing, not revealing the face, but unveiling the hidden. And perhaps that's what the CIA unknowingly built through the Gateway Project, a two-way mirror. On one side, the machinery, sound patterns, biometric feedback, pulse monitors. On the other, the unspoken history of each participant, their grief, forgotten intuitions, unhealed echoes, and somewhere in between, something began to awaken. The true mirror doesn't show you what you want to see. It shows you what's already there, stripped of costume, name, and memory. Many Gateway participants didn't just float outside their bodies. They encountered themselves, not as the world sees them, but as they had always been, before wounds, before roles, before forgetting. This isn't just neuroscience, this is initiation. Every inner transformation begins with a confrontation, and the oldest spiritual traditions all agree. Transformation requires a mirror, because you cannot walk forward until you have faced what has been hiding in your own shadow. Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet, believed that knowing the self was the beginning of soul awakening. In his trance states, he often described a descent, not into darkness, but into truth. Into the forgotten corridors of consciousness where the soul still waits. The Gnostics took it further. For them, the visible world was illusion. The real journey wasn't outward, it was downward, inward, through memory, through stillness, through vision unclouded by physical eyes. And in many ways, the Gateway experience was recreating this exact process. When subjects described a profound sense of oneness with the universe, they weren't describing hallucinations. They were narrating what it feels like when perception pierces the veil. That's when the question shifts from "is this real?" to "where does this touch me?" It's subtle, but it changes everything. Because that shift means we've stopped searching for proof and started listening for resonance. The mirror turns into a portal, not when it shows something new, but when we finally have the courage to see what's been waiting. And so techniques of self-observation, drawn from Cayce's readings and ancient mystic practice, become less about reaching new states and more about shedding the false ones. Stillness is no longer passive, it becomes a tuning, a sacred alignment. The two-way mirror doesn't just reflect you, it sees you. And when you are seen without pretense, without denial, without shame, the soul speaks. Not loudly, not with drama, but with the quietest voice you've ever heard. The one that whispers, "You never forgot, you only fell silent." And that whisper is the real crossing, not a technique, not a theory, but a return. In 1983, the final report of the Gateway Project was submitted with clinical precision. Each paragraph was measured, each hypothesis dressed in careful terminology. On the surface, it read like a study of brain states and altered perception. But between the lines, something else pulsed. Because beneath the language of oscillations and neuropatterns, there was a silence no scientist could name, a presence the report couldn't define. The researchers may have believed they were mapping consciousness, but what they were really touching was soul, and that is precisely what they could not translate. The CIA wanted a manual. What they received was a mirror. They expected a protocol. What they found was a portal, and portals cannot be controlled. They can only be entered. The report uses phrases like unified field of consciousness, removal of ego boundaries, and expanded perception. They sound technical, but what they're trying to describe is not technical at all. It's a kind of remembering. The return of something the body never carried, but the soul always did. The soul cannot be measured, it can only be answered. And that's the limit of every experiment that tries to bind the invisible to machines. No matter how advanced the technology, it will never detect what can only be felt. It was never about waves, it was about recognition. The deeper you read the report, the more you feel its edges. As if the authors themselves were nearing a door they didn't have the courage to walk through, because to walk through would mean surrendering the need to know, and science fears what it cannot categorize. But some things were never meant to be categorized, they were meant to be lived. Maybe that's why the Gateway Project quietly dissolved. Because what it uncovered wasn't sustainable under the weight of institutional logic. It touched something sacred, and institutions don't know what to do with sacred. The greatest secret the CIA discovered might not be how to leave the body, but how to finally return to it with new eyes. With the understanding that the body is not a container, but a threshold. That consciousness is not confined, but mirrored through form. And that the soul is not a theory, it's a listener. Waiting for the noise to stop, waiting for you to remember. So now, pause, breathe, and ask yourself, if your soul could speak, without fear, without interruption, what would it ask you to remember? Maybe that answer is already moving inside you, beneath the surface of thought, between memory and dream. And maybe the real experiment was never conducted in a lab. Maybe it's happening now, inside you, in silence, in stillness, in the space where no language reaches, but truth does. Everything you've heard so far, the frequencies, the still body, the alert mind, it's not ultimately about science, it's about you. Because the real experiment was never confined to a CIA lab or wrapped in biometric wires. It's happening now, in your breath, in the way you feel right now, listening. This video was never meant to deliver answers. It was meant to reopen a question that's been echoing inside you since before you had language for it. Have you ever felt like you don't fully belong to this world? Have you sensed a presence in the quiet moments? Not a ghost, but a memory of yourself, older than your name? Then perhaps. The Gateway wasn't just a classified experiment. Perhaps it was a collective remembering. The participants in the Gateway Project spoke of dissolving into light, of touching an intelligence that felt ancient and yet intimately familiar. But the report called it non-local consciousness and archived it under controlled vocabulary because language always arrives too late. What the CIA touched, without fully understanding, wasn't proof that the soul exists. It was a doorway to what your soul has always known. And what if the sky isn't a place? What if the sky is simply the memory of what you already are? What if the tone they tried to isolate through Hemi-Sync was the sound of your own soul trying to call you home? The real discovery isn't in the documents. It's in the shift that happens the moment you stop asking for proof and start remembering your own silence. The CIA may have found a key, but the lock, that's personal. It lives inside your choices, your stillness, your pain, your awe. And the soul doesn't open with logic, it opens with presence. So maybe all this time you weren't looking for an explanation. Maybe you were waiting for a signal, not to guide you elsewhere, but to bring you back to where you never truly left, to that sacred center where nothing needs to be proven because everything is already known. If something stirred within you, leave a sign, a dot, a silence, so others will know they're not alone.